Good afternoon, Ames Chamber of Commerce members. This is Drew Camp, Director of Public Policy and Business Development, as well as Executive Director of Ames Main Street, here for our weekly report for the weekly governmental update for the week of February 22nd, which is kind of crazy to say, meaning that we're almost to March already, and then hopefully that'll bring some spring weather with it. There's a few issues that I do want to touch on that did happen and have some motion down at the legislature this week, some of which are huge priority issues for us, so we were really excited to see those kind of start gaining some momentum. Some of those items include Future Ready Iowa, which is a big workforce development initiative of the governor and the business community, so we're really excited to see that move forward. The House Republicans also put out their budget targets for fiscal year 2020. That's a really good first step, but it's very important to note that is only one chamber. They are not the same as the governor's numbers. They're not going to be the same as the Senate's numbers. They all obviously have to find consensus before they can adjourn sine die for the legislative session, and we haven't even reached the first funnel, so there's a lot to still be discussed, but it is a very good starting point. There's also a bill that I want to touch on that deals with property taxes. It's a House study bill. It's in House Ways and Means, so it's funnel proof, so I'll touch on that. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that's one we've talked about a couple weeks now. I'll touch on that one, as well as the Secure and Advanced Vision for Education, school infrastructure, sales tax penny, an extension for that, as well as school funding, which was actually signed by Governor Reynolds this week, the first bill she signed of this legislative session, which is really exciting, but I'll get to that here in a little bit. To start with Future Ready Iowa, that's, like I said, a huge priority issue for the Ames Chamber of Commerce, for the legislature itself, and any business organization, because it really deals with workforce development, but also economic and community development as we look to attract the workforce we need to the state of Iowa. And that's a critically important thing, especially for a community like Story County, who has 1.4% unemployment. House Study Bill 179, which is the vehicle for Future Ready Iowa this year, includes full funding of the initiative as passed by the legislature in 2018. That is really important because so many times we see a bill proposed and then it's not fully funded or not funded at all. So the fact that this proposal actually fully funds that initiative is a really big deal. And what that would do is it would provide $17.2 million for the Last Dollar Scholarship and $1.2 million for the Iowa Employer Innovation Fund, which will help encourage public-private partnerships throughout the state, which is something we always encourage as a chamber and economic development organization. I also wanted to touch on, as I mentioned before, the fact that the House Republicans unveiled their budget targets for FY 2020. The number is $7,667,975,760. Try saying that 3 times fast, which is just slightly more than what Governor Reynolds put forward in her budget proposal. And the unveiling of these targets is a critical first step in the appropriations process, which is always the last part of the legislative session. But as I mentioned before, not only does it not line up with the governor's numbers, it's a little higher than that. The Senate hasn't released their targets yet. They haven't even started talking about the actual appropriations bills, which will ultimately have to be determined and broadly provide a consensus between both chambers and passed by both chambers and signed by the governor for them to go into law. So this is a very good starting point, but we do know that we need to continue to watch how that moves forward with the Senate as they talk about it. Some important numbers within that budget that I wanted to touch on is there's a $41.02 million proposal for economic development, a $41.1 million proposal for ag and natural resources, and $961.4 million for education. And I'll touch a little bit more on education funding later in the video. The next issue I wanted to touch on deals with property tax. We knew that there was going to be discussion on property tax this legislative session. It's something we've kind of been watching very closely because you have to really handle it delicately as you look at how it's going to be done, because there's so many things that could be part of that proposal. Well, the House took the first shot across the bow on property tax with HSB's House Study Bill 165. And what that does is it establishes budget limitations for counties and cities and their property tax levies. So obviously there's some concern by some entities involved with those within the county government. They're registered against the bill, and then the city governments, which are monitoring the bill. We are registered as neutral, as the League of Cities are as well, last I checked. And what we're really doing here is we need to wait on what the Senate puts out, because we have no clue what's going to be included in their proposal. Just as I mentioned with the budget numbers, it could be highly different, very, very different than what the House put forward. So we really need to maintain flexibility as we look at this, because we don't know if it's going to include proposals to impact tax increment financing. We don't know if it'll impact the property tax backfill. And by staying registered neutral and undecided, we can really adapt to whatever is proposed down the line in the session. So that's going to give us a level of flexibility that we really need moving forward with this property tax discussion. The Freedom the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA is the term you may hear it referred to as, passed a Senate subcommittee, the local government subcommittee, which is interesting because technically it probably should be moving through the state government committee, but that's a discussion for another day. We do hope that that bill will be passed, not passed, killed, will not pass before the March 8th funnel deadline. If it does not move out of that committee, it will not be able to pass that March 8th funnel, and it will die because it's not an appropriations or a Ways and Means bill. The reason we want to see this bill die is it really negatively impacts diversity and inclusion, not only from a statewide perspective and a community perspective, but from a business perspective. It could really be a liability issue for companies as well, in the fact that a lot of the times it does, in some ways, and it is a way for some people to possibly use it as a vehicle for what a lot of people would classify as discrimination and a lack of inclusivity and diversity, and that's the last thing we want to see. Ames and Story County and Iowa are very inclusive communities, and the last thing we want to do is propose a bill that companies will look at and say, no way we want to be located here, or the NCAA will look at and be like, no, we don't really need to have our first round or our Sweet 16 playoffs of the March Madness coming to Iowa, which could have adverse economic impacts, which is obviously the last thing we want to see anytime we're looking at a bill. The SAVE bill, which stands for Secure and Advanced Vision for Education, the School Infrastructure Sales Tax Penny. It's looking like that bill should receive broad bipartisan support to get past this legislative session. What the bill would do is, right now, that sales tax penny currently sunsets in 2029, which is an issue for 10-year bonds. So what they're looking at doing is extending it to January 1st, 2051, and that would really provide that certainty that school districts need to bond out for those projects for now and into the foreseeable future. So we're obviously in support of that bill to help our school districts with their infrastructure projects. It's also important to note a fiscal note came out on the SAVE bill, and it will provide $530.7 million in FY 2020, which they're currently working through. That'll start in July, and it will provide a total of $577.4 million by FY 2024. So there's growth to be seen in the outlying years, which is always a positive as expenses continue to increase with time. Finally, the last issue I want to touch on is a bill that we talked about last week as well, and it's school funding. And it's super important because that's the biggest piece of the budget, and also it's something that can be highly contentious. And the legislature is supposed to do it within the first 30 days, which they were able to do this time. It was the first bill the governor signed into law this year, which we are very happy to see because it provides that certainty and flexibility that school districts need in their budgeting process. Just a few pieces I want to touch on regarding the school funding. It provides an increase of 2.06%. It's important to note that that's only 0.4, that's just under about 0.5% less than what they provided the last 2 years combined. So that's something that's really important. They almost provided what they had the last 2 years combined, and this year alone, just under that. And that's something that's really important to highlight because that's really good for our school districts to be getting that kind of an increase in over 2%. As you break it down, the total is about $89.3 million that will be provided, and $78.6 million will go to supplemental state aid. That's the biggest chunk, obviously. $2.9 million will go to state per pupil funds, and a total of $19 million will go to transportation equity funding. And that's really important for some school districts that have really, as consolidation and other issues, have caused them to expand and consolidate. Their territory has really expanded, and then their transportation cost to transport students to and from school has increased. So it's important to see that there's a significant amount of money there as well for transportation equity funding. And I know we were happy to see those bills signed into law for the certainty and stability they provide our school districts, which they certainly deserve as they work towards their March 14th budget deadlines. One thing I want to mention, well, two things actually I want to mention before we close out this week's legislative update. Please put on your calendars next Friday, March 1st at the Ames Community School District Administration Building from 11:30 to 1 p.m. There will be a state legislative luncheon with our local state legislators. Please try to get that on your calendar and attend. It is a $10 fee to attend, and lunch will be provided by Tasteful Caterings and Rick and his team, who always do a nice job. And also Thursday, March 14th, Ames Day at the Capitol will be taking over the Capitol Rotunda. So please, if you are interested in having a booth or being a participant in just the community showcase from 11:30 to 1 o'clock, please do not hesitate to reach out and let me know that. So those are the two things I really wanted to cover. As you can see, we really do have some positive momentum going into the next week of the legislative session as we get ever closer from 2 weeks out to the first legislative deadline and the first funnel. That's going to be highly important to make sure that we continue to move these issues forward and not only see the issues we want to move forward, but also some of the issues that we don't want to see move forward, not move forward. So please come back and join us next week for I'm sure what will be another very informative and lively update as we continue to see more legislation push through the Iowa State Legislature. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend.